Hello, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, one who works for the Center for Risk Analysis and one who works for the IRR. And I just want to say that today's show is very demographically skewed in one direction. That's because 2/3 of it come from the East Rand. So I'm joined today by Mr. Marius Roodt, show regular, the Lion of Benoni, as we sometimes call him. Marius, how are you today?
How's it, Nick?
And we are also joined, I think, for the first time on the podcast. I'm not sure, but correct me if I'm wrong. Mr. Bheki Mahlobo, who is an analyst for the Center for Risk Analysis. Bheki, how are you today?
I'm well on yourself, Nick. Yes, indeed. This is my very first time. Glad to be here. How's it, Marius?
How's Bheki?
Very good to have you here with us, sir. Right, so let's get stuck into the stories for today. And our first story on this Wednesday. Well, let me say that our first story on this today is that today the IRR went with Big Daddy Liberty to the union buildings to hand over our memorandum about citizen abuse to the presidency. So tomorrow we're going to hear a report back on that from probably from Gabriel Krauser and also from Amy Claire Morton, who were there with Big Daddy Liberty. Right, so our first regular story for today is regarding South Africa's vaccine rollout, or rather our glacial vaccine rollout. So the government has endeavored to vaccinate all of South Africa's medical workers as quickly as possible. I'm not sure of the numbers there. I've heard both 550,000 and 1.5 million people are in this sort of first phase of vaccination. And some have argued that this is not the right group to target initially because a lot of them have probably already been exposed to COVID from being on the front lines. Others say it's important to get them vaccinated so that they can work properly. Regardless, this is the government's goal. And so far, they don't really seem to be doing a particularly good job of it. So the highest number of vaccinations we've managed in one day so far, I believe, was on the 26th of February when we managed 11,001. Since then, the number has come down to 3,600, 3,200, 2,500, and yesterday 2,900, which is, shall we say, very slow. In fact, just to finish the healthcare workers at this rate, it's going to take months and months. Now, as government has centralized the vaccine distribution and control, some civil rights organizations, some people out there have been fighting to see if the private sector can get involved and start helping in the rollout of this vaccine. AfriForum and their trade union parent Solidarity were in court with the government yesterday, and the government admitted that they had put no restrictions on the private sector actually purchasing the vaccine. They said that it was all down to the vaccine companies refusing to deal with anyone but government. But from inquiries that have been made by people around the IRR, we know that a lot of companies are actually willing to sell to private organizations as long as it's legal to do so. And so far, it appears as though it's legal to do so. So our colleague Gabriel Krauser wrote a very great article it was in Media 24 about Discovery, the medical aid, and their role in this. So let me go to you, Bheki. How long is it going to take us to vaccinate everyone? I believe Gabriel mentioned it in his article, but I can't remember the number. It's going to take a while to vaccinate everyone.
So in Gabriel's article, I believe he mentioned that if we go at this pace, it might take South Africa 10 years to reach 2/3 of the population, in order for 2/3 of the population to essentially be vaccinated. And that's truly tragic, because I think what the government's really doing here or what they've done essentially with the centralization of the procurement of the vaccine, they were trying to make this the first step towards introducing NHI, National Health Insurance. And I think the narrative they would have played around this is that if they were successful in rolling out the vaccine through a centrally planned way, then they could say, yeah, we are also successful. We would also be successful in rolling out NHI. And the failure of this and the slow rolling out of vaccine should be proof that national centralized planning does not work and largely fails. And I think this is why we need a private sector. It's very important that we have a private sector, especially in matters such as this, because South Africa cannot afford to be left behind the world in terms of vaccine procurement. Not only that, but some of the point that you've covered quite well in the previous episodes, Nick, is that this virus mutates, right? And we don't want it to be more infectious. We don't want it to be more deadly. Otherwise, we could risk more lockdowns coming through. And that's something that South Africans cannot afford. We lost like 1.4 million jobs last year. That's livelihoods. That's people's lives destroyed right there. And that's something that South Africa cannot afford.
Right. No, that's a really good point. And if the vaccination program is too slow, the virus is just going to be able to mutate around the vaccine. It'll have to constantly get updates and booster shots. And then what's the point in vaccinating the population? You might as well just maintain social distancing or completely give up on the whole thing altogether, which would be a total failure of government policy. Marius, your thoughts on this? I mean, is Bheki right when he says that this was, you think, perhaps a trial run for the national health insurance?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe perhaps not a trial run, but definitely the government would have wanted to show, look how well we've run this thing. And they've done pretty poorly. And there I saw a stat earlier, I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but it showed the countries, number of countries around the world and the proportion of people, of their populations that have received at least one COVID shot. Nearly 60% of Israelis have received at least one COVID shot. And I saw Morocco, at least 10% of Moroccans have received one COVID shot and 8% of Turks. And those are kind of countries that are around about our level of income. They're not rich countries that can, they're not the Canadas or, UKs or Germanys of the world that can afford to buy 4 or 5 times the number of vaccines that they need for their populations. And Turkey's also, the economy is also under quite a lot of strain at the moment, but they're managing to vaccinate a big proportion of their population. So it just shows, the government's, it just shows how poorly, and this shows that the consequences for bad policy. We've had bad fiscal policy for the past 10 years. That's meant we don't have money for vaccines, and we're finding the money, luckily. But also we're going to rely a lot on the private sector, I think, to ensure that South Africans are vaccinated. But I think a good example of how the private sector is stepping up is Sibanye Stillwater gold mining company, and its CEO Neil Frenneman. I think about 2 weeks ago, maybe a bit less, he said, according to him and the research his company had done, it was legal then already for private companies to procure vaccines. And he said he would be getting vaccines for all his employees. I think they're the biggest employer in South Africa, private sector employer, at about 70,000 people that work for them. And also, he also said they would vaccinate all his employees' dependents, as well as the people who lived in the communities around the mines. So I think that's one place where, private sector stepping up, filling the gap where the government is failing, which is unfortunately becoming pretty common in South Africa. And I think, I think the private sector is going to have to step up here to ensure that people do get vaccinated. We've already seen that there's rumors that the governments are going to force medical aid companies to use some of their funds to help pay for people who aren't members of medical aid to get vaccinated, which some may say that's maybe the right thing to do. But I think there's also a problem with the government saying to members of medical aid that they're going to use your after-tax money to vaccinate people. I think most people are actually quite happy to fork out a bit more and help people who can't afford or aren't on medical aids to get vaccinated. But I think there's a problem with the government telling you that they will take the money, and it's not being a kind of a what's what I'm looking for, a voluntary thing.
Right, that would be another example of citizenship abuse, actually, because
exactly.
The state has allocated large amounts of money already to vaccine procurement. It should be more than enough. In fact, if the government had misspent or stolen so much money, then we'd have more than enough for the vaccination. So if they demand that the medical aids pay for it, in a way, they're basically adding another tax on the citizenship to say, oh, you guys have to fork out again for our mistakes to cover the people who can't afford it. And like you said, it's, people, I'm sure people would be willing to do that. I know a lot of companies are volunteering on this point, and they say that they'll step up. But there's some companies who are making a lot of lip service. And this was, I think, what Gabriel was getting at in his article. I think he spoke specifically about Discovery. And he said, their CEO had been very supportive of Cyril and said that they were working hard to get the vaccine to their members. But it does seem as though the only thing preventing, based on what we heard in court from Solidarity and the government yesterday, But the only thing actually stopping private companies from getting here is that they don't want to upset the ANC's centralization programs. So for the sake of the ANC's ideology, it looks like a lot of people in the business sector, particularly in big business, with the exception of people like Froneman, and government, are hewing to their ideological goal to centralize rather than getting vaccines to people in the fastest way, which is madness.
I think just on Neil Froneman, he's been one of the only business leaders who's spoken out against a lot of this bad policy in South Africa. And he said, I mean, that Sibanye-Stillwater is not even looking to invest in South Africa at the moment until the policy gets right. And as I said, I mean, they're the biggest private sector employer in the country. So if they were really doing big investments in South Africa, imagine how many more people they'd employ, how many more other people would be employed by other companies, not just mining companies. So as I said, bad policy has real consequences, whether it's government not being able to pay for stuff or people not being able to get jobs because companies don't want to invest in South Africa.
Yeah, and I think quite. Oh yeah, sorry, carry on, Bheki.
Oh, sorry. And I think business could actually play a role in actually pressurizing government to avoid those bad policies. I mean, an example I looked to last year is that when taxi owners essentially told the government to stuff it last year, when they said you could only have this much of your passengers in a given ride. I think that's what, like, essentially Discovery needs to do, and other medical aid companies. They need to actually stand up for their members and tell the government, like, hey, listen, the centralization of vaccine procurement does not make sense to us, does not make sense to our members. Therefore, we'll go ahead with the purchasement of vaccines.
Right, and I'm sure the government probably could, just with a little bit of social pressure, get those medical aids to fork out a lot of voluntary money for vaccines for the rest of the population that are not their members anyway, as like a sort of corporate branding charity exercise, the way that corporates often do already.
I'm sure many people, if they got told, do you mind if we use 500 rand of your medical savings to vaccinate 20 people? I think many people would say yes, go ahead. Of course, I'll get some people say no, but I think that's the issue. As long as voluntary, a lot of people will be prepared to voluntarily step up. I think that the issue is the government taking your money without your permission, your after-tax money that you've saved up. I think that's the issue. Exactly. I would be happy, and I'm sure most people would be happy to fork out a bit of extra to get South Africa vaccinated, get everything back to normal, and put COVID behind us finally.
Yeah, it's time to stop messing around, because that's currently where we seem to be. Anyway, speaking of messing around, everyone's favorite state-owned enterprise, Eskom. I don't know whether to call it the country's most dysfunctional state-owned enterprise or the second most dysfunctional, because you could also make a strong case for SAA. But of course, Eskom affects us more. They're once again back in the news. When I saw this story, I think when I sent it to you, Marius, you just sort of put your head in your hands and despaired, because Parliament is set to launch another inquiry into Eskom, but this time relating to allegations made against the new CEO, Andre de Ruyter. So the investigation stems from a complaint launched with Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts, normally called SCOPA, by the suspended Chief of Procurement, Soli Shisangano. Apologies for my pronunciation. I'm always bad with everyone's pronunciation. But anyway, Sishangano alleges that de Ruyter and other managers are purposely purging black suppliers in the supply chain, and he's also leveled a number of other accusations. Parliament will now investigate these claims to see whether, in fact, de Ruyter is, purposely targeting black procurement firms. And once again, it's a cloud over Eskom, which of course has been struggling with all sorts of problems for a very long time now. And my initial thought on this, Marius, is it really doesn't seem very likely, considering that de Ruyter has not spoken out against the BEE requirements that have been placed on Eskom. Despite groups like the IRR pointing out that these inflate the cost of procurement, de Ruyter talks about procurement being a problem, but then he doesn't specify what that problem is. And we'd argue that it's BEE requirements. My read on this is that there's a factional battle here between different parts of the ANC. Maybe de Ruyter is closer to the Cyril faction, and Shisangano is closer to the anti-Cyril faction. What's your take on it, Marius?
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's one of these things that's really just taking away from the real problems in South Africa. I mean, if Eskom fails in South Africa, will be pretty close to failing. So I think it's just one of these things. I think you're right. It's also, as you said, Mr. Chisangano, he's the suspended procurement officer. So I'd be very surprised if this isn't him trying to hit back at what might be very real accusations against him. So now he's trying to he's using a weapon that lots of people use to go up against people they don't like. Is call them a racist, and that's one of the worst things you can call somebody in South Africa and the world actually. So I think somebody it's kind of used as a final option to say the rate is actually, so he's purging black suppliers, and that's actually why I lost my job, because I was trying to get black suppliers being used by Eskom and so on. So I think it's one of these, it's really just a sideshow, I'm sure, but as I say, it's probably part of this larger factional battle between the Ramaphosa and Reformers faction. Not really though, because I don't want to reform anything, but they want to keep the status quo, and the RVT faction, the Jacob Zuma faction sort of thing, where they want to get back to the trough and loot what's left of what's left in the vault, so to speak.
Right, exactly. And I think that it's a sign that perhaps there's parts of Parliament that are more closely aligned with the anti-Cyril faction, that they're taking these accusations so seriously, because I mean, accusations made by a suspended staff member who's been suspended for improper conduct, or I can't remember the exact charge leveled against him, but he's facing possibly being fired. It really does seem like it's not the most credible place to make an accusation from. Anyway, let me go to Bheki. Bheki, you've looked a lot at the numbers around Eskom. What are your thoughts on this issue? Where is Eskom currently? It seems like De Ruyter claims that he's been turning around Eskom. Do you think that's actually true?
So the major issue with Eskom really, it suffers from an incentive problem, and incentives are very important. They guide our everyday decisions, how you budget your income after receiving your salary, how you seek employment, and the same is true with Eskom. And when you dilute that, things become milky. And what's essentially happened with Eskom is that incentive has been diluted with political interference, and so the decisions taken by Eskom are milky. So as you mentioned, Nick, I've been looking at Eskom for quite some time now, and my favorite indicator to look at Eskom is the energy availability factor. And essentially what happens is that you have an indicator out of 100%, which is essentially broken down to energy availability factor, which is essentially the production capacity of Eskom, and then the rest is essentially outrage factors.
That's how much electricity they're actually producing.
Yes, that's how much electricity they're actually producing. And then the rest is categorized as outrage factors, which is such things as maintenance, or which is called planned outrage factor, and unplanned outrage factor, which is when you essentially have Eskom power stations burning up. That's not planned.
As happens from time to time.
Yeah, that happens from time to time due to lack of maintenance or oversight. And so Eskom's energy availability factor over the past 10 years essentially dipped. It was sitting at 85%, now it's sitting below 60%. If you draw that timeline 10 years before, like 20 years ago, it was sitting at 90%. So it's it's having a sharp decline. And when you look at the unplanned outrage factor, that is essentially increased from 10 years ago from roughly 6% to now sitting at about 25%. This is actually quite dangerous, and I don't think Eskom in its condition right now will be in a position in which it will be able to produce enough electricity for the economy.
So you're saying that basically a quarter of all potential energy that could be produced by Eskom is currently down due to unplanned outages.
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Oh my word.
That's exactly what
crazy.
I'm saying.
So Bheki, how do we get out of this?
Well, a lot of South Africa's problems can be solved with a little bit less political interference. Like I mentioned, you need to stop diluting the water. You need to stop diluting the water at Eskom. You need to take away political interference at Eskom. And Eskom needs to be governed just like a business, just like any other business. And any other business is faced with incentives. If they make bad decisions, they go under. That's why most businesses don't make bad decisions, because they don't want to go under. And the problem with Eskom is that they're not allowed to go under through bailouts, and now with an increase in tariff charges, which is
it's what, 450 billion rand or something in debt.
It's 450 billion rand in debt. That's extremely bad for a company. And so what essentially needs to happen with Eskom is that you need to take away political interference. You need to allow the CEO to actually take the decisions needed to be taken in Eskom in order for it to thrive.
Right, and that presumably, as we've talked about before on the show, would involve choosing suppliers based not on the color of their skin, but their ability to provide for the company. That would be firing staff who are redundant rather than keeping them on because they're afraid to annoy the unions, and just generally running things better, not avoiding outages so as to.
And I think opening up the energy sector too, I think that's also part of it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that could be done, but that could be done essentially on day one.
Gwedi Mantashe apparently just has to sign a document, and that'll open up the energy sector. I mean, it's waiting for Gwedi Mantashe's signature, basically.
Right.
So
once again, we're seeing something that looks like citizenship abuse in the story, where the government, due to ideological desire to hold on to Eskom and centralizing it, is making us all suffer through power outages.
Just on that point, Nick, sorry, just to add a little bit. The main narrative in the early years of Eskom was for it not to be privatized, was to essentially say that if it was privatized, then you'd see an increase in prices, and that will obviously hurt the poor South African citizens. But Eskom tariff charges have been well above inflation. In fact, I've seen some reports that state that over the past 10 years or so, they've increased about 300%. That's taxation on the poor, and it extremely hurts the poor. And so if you allow other producers to come in, like what Marius mentioned, to actually decrease the price of electricity, prices are not supposed to go up; they're supposed to go down.
I think a good example is SAA. I mean, SAA is always the most expensive flight. If you want to fly down to Cape Town or whatever, SAA is always far more expensive than Comair or Fly Safari or whatever one of the other providers. And because they don't have to be competitive. They know if they're not going to make money, they'll get bailed out. If they weren't getting bailed out, I'm sure SAA the price would be the same as the other competitors. That same kind of privatization, not necessarily, like I said, it's often much better for the poor than harming them.
Exactly. I mean, if the goal of nationalization was to protect the poor, and that's completely failed because prices are going up by enormous amounts. And the economy is hurting because it can't get enough electricity. So it's literally...
And also money that could be used to stimulate the economy, people buying goods rather going into black hole of Eskom.
Yeah, exactly. Where I don't know how they managed to get so in debt. Presumably they have a big pile where they just burn all the money.
Maybe they just use the credit card to match at the pub on Fridays. I don't know.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So we've had two bad news stories. With frustratingly obvious solutions. But let's move now to what could be a very good news story, although it's still a little bit too early to tell. So I ask our listeners and watchers to bear with us because this is a little bit, I think, beyond any of our wheelhouse, because it's talking about medication and disease mechanics. But as many people
when has that ever stopped us, Nick? Talking about something that's not in our wheelhouse.
Well, I think it's better to have full disclosure sometimes. So as many people know, HIV, AIDS probably comes from Central Africa. It's suspected to come from somewhere around Cameroon or the Congo or the Democratic Republic of Congo. Even as far back as 100 years ago. And the exact method of transmission because it originates in apes to humans is not known, although there's some who suspect that it comes from eating bushmeat, because there were lots of people working in the jungle at that time eating like apes and things that had been shot. Anyway, that's not particularly important, except that there has been a study that's been published in the eBiomedicine, which is part of the Lancet family of medical journals. And it looked at samples taken from people living with HIV between 1987 and 2019. Now, the researchers, when they looked at these samples, found a very interesting thing about some of the people who were infected with HIV in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They found that around 4% of the people who were sampled were able to suppress the virus naturally without taking antiretrovirals, which is what most people have to do who are infected with HIV. Now, there are some people who are able to do this naturally outside of the DRC, but it's less than 1% of people who are infected with HIV. So it's very rare. And suddenly you've got, 1/20th of the population able to suppress the virus, which suggests that because it's been present there for so long, that human bodies are slowly adapting to the virus and overcoming it. Now, the virus could always mutate to get around this, and obviously it's 4% is not a large part of the population, but one of the things that this does potentially allow is for scientists to be able to research the mechanism by which these people's bodies are suppressing the virus, and then potentially develop medication that will cure HIV, or at least make it even less dangerous than it is than the current antiretroviral medicines do when you take them now. So it's also unknown whether this immunity lasts for the entire progress of the disease, or whether it only lasts for a few years before people get sick anyway. And so it ends up just being a delay. But regardless, I think it could potentially be good news, because it means that a cure for HIV might be closer than we think. Marius, just quite quickly, let me go to you, and then we'll finish off with Bheki here. That would be a pretty big deal for Southern Africa, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think so. As we were talking before the show, HIV/AIDS is not as serious a problem as it used to be. That's because of ARVs. But as we said, having to take chronic medication for your whole life is obviously not pleasant. It's not something you want to do. People often still have reactions to ARVs, or there's still a stigma around being infected. Exactly, and there's still a stigma to being infected with HIV for many people. So it's obviously not great. Obviously, HIV is not the death sentence was 30 or 25 years ago, and it's pretty much equivalent of having something like diabetes, a disease that can get managed. And so it's not something that you want to have, and like I just said about ARVs, it's not something you want to have to take every day. So this would be great for Southern Africa. It would obviously we know that diseases can often also have bad economic effects. So if we can get rid of something like HIV/AIDS, also get rid of the stigma and what have you. That's not to say that we shouldn't still be be cautious when you in the bedroom and so on. But I do think I think it's a good thing for Africa and the world in general. But also if we manage to get a cure, it'll also be I think something we as humans can be proud of. Same as the COVID vaccine, which when COVID started, people were talking about there'll be a vaccine for this thing in tops 5 years, and within a year we had vaccines that worked. And I think that's up there with the landing the moon, and the cell phones, and the computing power we have now is some of the greatest things that humans have done in the past 40 or 50 years.
Right. No, yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. Just before I go to you, Bheki, I want to say, there are still people who don't get antiretrovirals, despite the enormous efforts of not only the South African government, but also foreign governments like the US government to provide them to people at very affordable prices, or even for free. And yet there are still people who fall through the cracks, people who just never get tested and they die from it because they only discover that they have HIV when it's too late. Bheki, in the last sort of 60 seconds or so of the show, what do you think the impact would be of curing it?
Yeah, Nick, this is very good news. An indicator I like to look at is the life expectancy of people. And this will, if we manage to find a cure for HIV, this will dramatically increase the life expectancy of people. And that has a major impact on the productivity of people. If people live longer, there will be more innovations for people. There will be more innovations for us to benefit from. The fact that I have pretty much good standard of living is due to past generations before me that went through harsh times in order to essentially innovate, and I'm essentially reaping from those hard labor. And this is essentially good news. It means that people will be able to produce more in the future, will be more productive, and will be essentially a higher standard of living.
Right. No, that's good stuff. And there's a lot of things coming down the pipeline now for Africa as a continent. There's economic growth over a lot of the continent. The continent has a lot of strong population growth, unlike the rest of the world, which, contrary to popular belief, is actually seeing declines in population over large parts of the rest of the world, particularly in places like China, or at least a slowing down of population growth. And so, we're potentially about to be on the verge of developing new malaria vaccines and medication, because there's a lot of developments that have been made in that sphere recently. There's some positive signs about fighting HIV. And when you've got economic and population growth, most of Africa could be in a very good spot. Fortunately, it doesn't look like South Africa is going to be there because our policies are so awful. But that's the potential upside if we get things right in this country. Anyway, thank you. I will stop waffling on now and end the show by saying thank you very much for listening. If you want to support the IRR or the Daily Friend, please go to dailyfriend.co.za or the irr.org.za. Click the Join Us button and become a friend of the Institute of Race Relations. Please like or share this video if you enjoyed it. Please share it or leave a review for it if you are listening to it on a podcast app. And we will see you tomorrow for another exciting episode of the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.